On a cold evening in late 1952, in the back room of a barber shop on West 135th Street in Harlem, New York, a man sat alone at a small wooden table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him. He wore a dark wool overcoat, tailored but not flashy, and a gray fedora rested on the table beside him. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, though no one in Harlem had called him that in 30 years. To the neighborhood, to the police, to the press, and to the men who feared him, he was Bumpy. Yet he was 47 years old, and he had recently received a piece of information that would have sent most men in his position into a rage so consuming it would have ended in a body on the floor of a Harlem tenement before sunrise. The information was this: a young man named, according to multiple oral accounts passed through Harlem's community memory, though the exact name is not consistently documented across sources, had helped arrange an ambush meant to kill him. And that young man was the son of one of Bumpy Johnson's oldest and most trusted friends. The details of the ambush itself, according to accounts drawn from Harlem oral tradition and biographical research compiled by writers including Karen E. Quinones Miller, who authored one of the most detailed biographical treatments of Johnson's life, and later referenced in historical accounts of mid-century Harlem organized crime, are as follows. Johnson had been tipped off, likely through one of the many loyalty networks he had cultivated across decades, that a group of men connected to interests that wanted him removed from Harlem's power structure had set a trap. The location was a building Johnson was known to visit. The timing had been selected based on information about his habits that only someone inside his circle could have known. And the young man who had passed that information along, who had confirmed the time and the route and the lack of armed company, was not a stranger. He was the son of a man Bumpy Johnson had trusted for years, a man who had stood beside him during some of the most dangerous stretches of his life in Harlem. What happened next, or rather, what did not happen, is the part of this story that became legend on the streets of Harlem and that, according to multiple accounts, brought hard men to silence and, in some retellings, to tears. Bumpy Johnson did not retaliate against the young man. He did not have him beaten. He did not have him killed. He did not even confront him directly, at least not with violence. The reason was not weakness. It was not confusion. It was not fear. The reason was the boy's father. The bond Bumpy Johnson held with that man, a bond forged through years of shared risk, shared loyalty, and a code of conduct that Johnson had built his entire reputation upon, made the son untouchable. To harm the son would be to destroy the bond with the father. And for Bumpy Johnson, a man whose entire power rested not on territory or weapons, but on the architecture of trust he had built across Harlem, that destruction would have cost him more than any ambush ever could. This moment, quiet, agonizing, and largely invisible to anyone outside Bumpy Johnson's inner world, was not an isolated event. It was a crystallization of everything Johnson had learned across a lifetime that had taken him from a penniless boy in the Jim Crow South to the most powerful black figure in the most famous black neighborhood in America. To understand why he made the choice he made that night, and why that choice ultimately became one of the most powerful moves of his career, it is necessary to go back to the beginning. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born on October 31st, 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina. And the South Carolina of his childhood was a place of absolute and codified racial hierarchy, Black families in Charleston lived under a system designed at every level, legal, economic, social, and physical, to ensure their subordination. Johnson's family was not wealthy. His early years were shaped by the ordinary deprivations of black life in the early 20th century South. Limited schooling, limited work, and the constant ambient threat of white violence. There are accounts, as cited in multiple biographical sources, that a traumatic racial incident during Johnson's youth, possibly involving the death or brutal mistreatment of a family member or community member at the hands of white men, played a role in his family's decision to send him north. The exact details of this incident vary across sources, and it is important to note that no single fully verified account exists. What is consistently reported is that young Ellsworth was sent to live with relatives in Harlem sometime around 1919 or 1920, when he was approximately 14 or 15 years old. He arrived in a Harlem that was in the early stages of what would become the Harlem Renaissance, a cultural and intellectual flowering that would make the neighborhood world famous. But the Harlem that a teenage boy from South Carolina with no money, no connections, and no education experienced was not the Harlem of Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, or at least not primarily. It was the Harlem of overcrowded tenements, where entire families occupied single rooms in buildings owned by landlords who charged black tenants double or triple the rent charged to white tenants in comparable neighborhoods. It was the Harlem of jobs that paid almost nothing: porter work, kitchen work, a laundry work. Jobs that consumed a man's body and returned barely enough to survive. And it was the Harlem of a street economy that operated in the spaces the legitimate economy refused to serve, because the legitimate economy had been designed with considerable deliberation to exclude black people from meaningful participation. The young Johnson navigated this world with a combination of physical presence and a kind of watchful intelligence that people noticed. He was a big kid, tall and broad-shouldered, and he had a temperament that did not tolerate disrespect. He also had a bump on the back of his head, a physical feature noticeable enough that it became his name. The streets of Harlem in the early 1920s were governed by their own hierarchies: older men who controlled particular blocks or particular enterprises, younger men who competed for position and reputation, and an elaborate informal code of conduct that determined who could operate where and under what terms. Johnson learned this code quickly, not just its explicit rules, but its deeper logic, that in a community denied access to the formal institutions of law and order, the informal institutions that replaced them, reputation, respect, the capacity for both generosity and violence, were not optional. They were the architecture of survival. Within a few years of his arrival, the boy from Charleston had become Bumpy, and Bumpy had become known on the streets. He was known first as someone who could handle himself in a fight, which in the economy of street reputation was the most basic form of credential, but he was also known as someone who watched more than he talked, who listened more than he shouted, and who seemed to be calculating something that the men around him could not quite see. His early years in Harlem's underworld were shaped by violence. This is not romanticized. It is simply documented. Johnson was arrested multiple times as a young man. He carried weapons. He fought. He earned a reputation as someone who could not be intimidated, which, in the ecosystem of Harlem's streets, was a form of currency. But what distinguished Johnson, even in these early years, according to those who knew him and later spoke about him, was that his violence was never random, never performative, and never disconnected from a larger sense of strategy. He did not fight to fight. He fought because the world he lived in required it, and he understood, even young, that the men who lasted were not the ones who fought the most, but the ones who fought the least, because everyone already knew what would happen if they were crossed. This understanding, that power is most effective when it does not need to be exercised, would define the rest of his life. But it would take decades and extraordinary suffering, or for that understanding to mature into what it eventually became. The first great education of Bumpy Johnson's life came through a woman named Stephanie St. Clair, known throughout Harlem as Madam Queen. St. Clair was a numbers runner, a figure in the illegal lottery system that functioned as one of the primary economic engines of Black Harlem in the 1920s and 1930s. The numbers game was, in its essence, a community institution. Residents placed small bets, pennies, nickels, dimes, on a 3-digit number, and if their number hit, they received a payout. The operation required an enormous network of runners, collectors, and bankers, and it circulated money within the black community in a way that almost no legitimate business could, given the systematic exclusion of black people from mainstream banking, investment, and commerce. St. Clair ran one of the most successful numbers operations in Harlem, and she was also something more than a racketeer. She was an activist. She wrote letters to newspapers. She publicly challenged police corruption. She once took out an advertisement in a Harlem newspaper denouncing a police officer by name for his role in shaking down black numbers operators while protecting white ones. She fought for the rights of black Harlemites in a way that blurred the line between criminal enterprise and community advocacy, because in the Harlem of that era, those lines were already blurred by the sheer weight of exclusion and injustice that shaped every aspect of black economic life. The numbers game was illegal, yes, but so, in practical terms, was black economic independence. The laws were written and enforced in ways that made it nearly impossible for black people to build wealth through legitimate channels, and the numbers game existed in the space created by that impossibility. When Bumpy Johnson came into her orbit, the exact timeline is debated, but most sources place it in the late 1920s, she saw in him something beyond muscle. She saw intelligence. She saw the capacity for loyalty that went beyond mere obedience, and she saw a young man who, with the right guidance, could become not just an enforcer, but a leader. St. Clair was, in many accounts, one of the few people Johnson genuinely deferred to, and the education she provided him was more comprehensive than anything he could have received at any university open to black students at the time. Under St. Clair's mentorship, Johnson learned the numbers business from the inside, the mathematics of risk, the logistics of collection and distribution, the management of a workforce that operated entirely outside the protections of law. More importantly, he learned the political architecture of Harlem, who held power, how they held it, where the vulnerabilities were, and how money, loyalty, and information could be combined into a force that was more durable than violence alone. St. Clair taught him to read people, to read situations, and to think in systems rather than incidents. She taught him that a single act of violence, however satisfying, was always less effective than a sustained campaign of economic and social pressure. And she taught him, perhaps most importantly, that the respect of ordinary people, the women who ran households, the men who worked honest jobs, the children who watched everything and forgot nothing, was worth more than the fear of 100 rivals. This education would prove essential because a crisis was coming that would test everything Johnson had learned and would define the first great humiliation of his public life. The crisis arrived in the form of Arthur Flegenheimer, better known as Dutch Schultz. Schultz was a white gangster, a bootlegger who had built an empire during Prohibition and who, as Prohibition ended in 1933, began looking for new revenue streams. He looked at Harlem's numbers racket, a business generating millions of dollars a year, and he decided to take it. The takeover was not subtle. Schultz used violence, intimidation, and the corruption of law enforcement to muscle his way into Harlem's numbers operations. Black bankers who refused to cooperate were beaten, arrested on fabricated charges, or simply disappeared. The message was clear. The money that Black Harlem had built through its own enterprise now belonged to a white man from the Bronx. Stephanie St. Clair fought back. She went to the press. She went to the police, not to cooperate, but to expose the corruption that was enabling Schultz's takeover. She was, by all accounts, fearless. And Bumpy Johnson fought beside her, literally. There were shootings. There were street battles. The war between St. Clair's organization and Schultz's enforcers was real, and it was bloody. But the outcome was, for a time, devastating. Schultz's resources, his money, his connections to the broader organized crime infrastructure, and his access to corrupt police and politicians were simply too vast. By the mid-1930s, much of Harlem's numbers business had been absorbed into Schultz's operation, and the black bankers who had built it were either working for him at reduced pay or had been driven out entirely. This was the first great systemic humiliation of Bumpy Johnson's life, and it is important to understand it as precisely that: systemic. The insult was not personal. Schultz did not single out Johnson for disrespect because of some individual grievance. The takeover was a manifestation of a larger reality, that in America in the 1930s, even in the illegal economy, white power could override black enterprise whenever it chose to. The numbers racket was a black institution built by black hands, serving a black community, and it was simply taken. This was Jim Crow economics applied to the underworld, and Johnson felt it not only as a loss of income, but as a fundamental injustice. Dutch Schultz was murdered on October 23, 1935, shot in a Newark, New Jersey restaurant on the orders of the National Organized Crime Commission. His death did not liberate Harlem. Instead, control of the numbers racket and other Harlem enterprises passed to the Italian-American organized crime families, principally the organization controlled by Charles Lucky Luciano and later Vito Genovese. The structure that replaced Schultz was, in some ways, more sophisticated and more permanent. The Italian families did not wage open war on Harlem. Instead, they installed themselves at the top of the economic pyramid, taking a percentage of everything while leaving day-to-day operations in the hands of black operators who were, in effect, employees in a business they had created. Bumpy Johnson found himself in an impossible position. He was, by the late 1930s and into the 1940s, the most prominent black figure in Harlem's underworld. He had connections, respect, and influence. But he operated under the authority of the Italian families, and everyone knew it. He collected money that flowed upward to men who lived in other boroughs, who would never live in Harlem, who cared nothing for the community except as a source of revenue. Johnson was, and in the eyes of the power structure, a middleman, valuable, certainly, but subordinate. And for a man of his pride, his intelligence, and his deep connection to Harlem, this subordination was a wound that never healed. It is within this context, a man carrying decades of accumulated humiliation, a man who understood that the system itself was the enemy, not any individual within it, that the incident with his friend's son must be understood. The details, as noted, exist primarily within oral tradition and biographical accounts that sometimes diverge on specifics. What is consistent across sources is the essential architecture of the event. A young man, the son of one of Johnson's longtime trusted associates, had been turned, recruited, pressured, or persuaded by interests that wanted Johnson weakened or eliminated. These interests may have been connected to the Italian family's desire for more direct control, or they may have been connected to rival figures within Harlem's own power structure who saw Johnson as an obstacle. The young man provided information that was used to set up an ambush. Johnson was warned in time, and the ambush failed. The question of what came next was, in the world Johnson inhabited, not really a question at all. The code was clear. Betrayal was answered with violence. A man who helped set up an ambush against a figure of Johnson's stature had, by every rule of the street, forfeited his life. Johnson's own enforcers expected it. The men around him, men who had survived precisely because they understood that unanswered betrayal was an invitation for more, waited for the order. The order never came. Johnson's decision not to harm the young man was rooted in something that most people outside his world, and many within it, could not immediately comprehend. It was rooted in the relationship with the father. The father was a man who had been loyal to Johnson for years, through prison sentences, through territorial wars, through the grinding daily danger of life in Harlem's underworld. He was a man Johnson trusted, and trust, for Bumpy Johnson, was not a casual word. It was the foundation upon which every alliance, every business arrangement, every form of power he possessed ultimately rested. To kill the son, or even to harm him severely, would have been to destroy the father. Not physically, the father might have survived, but spiritually, emotionally, and in terms of the bond between two men who had built something together over decades. Johnson understood that if he broke that bond, he would not simply lose one ally. He would send a message to every other ally that loyalty had limits, that the code he preached could be overridden by circumstance, and that the trust they had placed in him was conditional. And so he did nothing, or rather, he did something far more difficult than violence. He absorbed the betrayal. He processed it privately in the silence of his own mind, with the patience of a man who had spent a lifetime learning that the first reaction was almost never the right one. He dealt with the young man through channels that did not involve bloodshed, the specifics of which are not fully documented, but which, according to accounts, involved a combination of permanent removal from his circle at the severing of all economic connections that had benefited the young man, and a direct private conversation in which the young man was made to understand exactly what had happened and exactly what had been spared. The conversation, according to one account relayed through Harlem's oral tradition, was conducted not by Johnson himself, but by intermediaries, men of sufficient standing that their words carried Johnson's full authority. The message was delivered without threats, yet without raised voices, and without ambiguity. The young man understood, and the young man's father, when he learned what had happened, both the betrayal and the mercy, is said to have wept. It was the father's reaction that gave the story its emotional power and ensured its survival in Harlem's collective memory. Here was a man who had discovered that his own son had tried to kill his closest friend, and that his closest friend had responded not with the destruction that was fully within his power and fully within his rights, by the rules they all lived by, but with a grace that transcended those rules entirely. The father's tears were not tears of relief, though relief was surely part of it. They were tears of recognition that he was standing in the presence of a kind of greatness that the world outside Harlem would never acknowledge, and that no newspaper would ever report. But that was as real and as profound as anything that had ever happened in any parliament or boardroom or hall of power anywhere on earth. The impact of this decision rippled outward through Harlem in ways that no act of violence ever could have achieved. Men who had been loyal to Johnson became more loyal, not out of fear, but out of a deepened respect that bordered on something closer to devotion. Men who had been considering offers from rival interests reconsidered, not because they feared retribution, but because they recognized that they were allied with a man whose principles were not negotiable and whose judgment was worthy of their trust. Men who had been neutral, watching, calculating, waiting to see which way the power would shift, made their decisions. And those decisions overwhelmingly favored Johnson. The story of what Bumpy had done and what he had chosen not to do became a currency of its own, and a piece of evidence cited in barber shops and on stoops and in the back rooms of churches as proof that Johnson was not simply a gangster. He was a man of principle, and in a community that had been systematically denied access to the institutions of justice, law, and governance that the rest of America took for granted, a man of principle who also possessed power was something close to sacred. This was the realization that the incident crystallized for Johnson, although it is likely he had been moving toward it for years. The system that kept Harlem subordinate, that kept black enterprise under white control, that kept black communities vulnerable to exploitation from both the legal and illegal economies, could not be defeated by violence. It could not be defeated by any single act, no matter how dramatic. It could only be defeated by the patient, deliberate construction of a network of loyalty so deep, so interwoven, and so resilient that no outside force could penetrate it without destroying itself in the process. Johnson's coalition building in the years surrounding and following this incident was methodical and drew from every sector of Harlem life. He cultivated relationships with legitimate business owners, the shopkeepers, the restaurateurs, the landlords, who depended on a stable, safe neighborhood for their livelihood. He maintained relationships with the clergy, who held enormous moral authority in a community where the church was often the only institution not controlled or corrupted by outside interests. He was known to provide financial support to families in need, paying rent, covering medical bills, buying school supplies for children. These acts were not charity in the way that word is normally understood. They were investments in the social infrastructure of Harlem, and Johnson understood them as such. And he also built relationships with lawyers and political figures. By the 1940s and 1950s, the civil rights movement was gaining momentum nationally, and Harlem was a critical node in that movement. Johnson, according to multiple accounts, had connections to political figures who were working to challenge the legal structures of segregation and discrimination. He is reported to have provided financial support to civil rights efforts. Though the exact nature and extent of this support is not always clearly documented, what is clear is that Johnson understood the connection between the legal fight for black rights and his own fight for autonomy within Harlem's power structure. Both were, at their root, struggles against a system designed to keep black people subordinate. His strategic approach operated on several levels simultaneously. Economically, and Johnson worked to ensure that as much money as possible circulated within Harlem rather than flowing outward to the Italian families. This did not take the form of open defiance. Johnson was too intelligent for that. Instead, it took the form of quiet redirection, supporting black-owned businesses, ensuring that his associates patronized local establishments, and using his influence to steer economic activity toward the community. The cumulative effect of these small decisions, multiplied across thousands of transactions and hundreds of relationships, was a gradual strengthening of Harlem's internal economy. Socially, Johnson cultivated a public persona that was deliberately calibrated to project dignity, stability, and community. He dressed well, always impeccably, in tailored suits and polished shoes, but never ostentatiously. He was known for his politeness, his literacy, and his capacity for thoughtful conversation. He read widely. And he was photographed with prominent figures in black culture and politics. He presented himself not as a figure of fear, but as a figure of respect, and this presentation was not superficial. It was a strategic choice, rooted in the understanding that the perception of power was itself a form of power, and that a man who was seen as a community elder, a protector, and a man of culture carried an authority that no amount of muscle could confer. Politically, Johnson navigated a complex landscape with remarkable skill. He maintained working relationships with law enforcement officials, some of whom were corrupt, some of whom were sympathetic, and some of whom simply recognized that Johnson's presence in Harlem served a stabilizing function that the police themselves could not provide. He also maintained, of necessity, his relationship with the Italian crime families, though this relationship was a constant source of tension. Johnson worked incrementally and persistently to expand the space of autonomy within which he and other black operators could function. Every concession he extracted, every arrangement he renegotiated, every small expansion of black control over black enterprise represented a measurable shift in the power structure. The pressure he exerted was not explosive. It was hydraulic. It operated slowly, continuously, and from multiple directions at once. And a business that had been paying tribute to an Italian overseer would find, gradually, that the terms of the arrangement had shifted. A neighborhood block that had been vulnerable to exploitation by outside interests would find, gradually, that Johnson's network of allies had created a buffer of protection. A political figure who had been ignoring Harlem's concerns would find gradually that Johnson's connections made ignoring Harlem politically costly. Over weeks and months and years, the effects accumulated. The Italian families, whose control over Harlem had seemed permanent and unchallengeable in the late 1930s, found by the 1950s that their hold was loosening. Not dramatically. There was no single confrontation, no grand showdown, but steadily. The cost of maintaining control increased. The returns diminished. The loyalty of the people they needed to run day-to-day operations, the runners, the collectors, and the street-level operators, shifted subtly but unmistakably toward Johnson and the network he had built. The families could still exert force, but force was expensive, and its effects were temporary. Johnson's power, built on trust and relationship and community embeddedness, regenerated itself every time it was challenged. There were moments of confrontation, certainly. Johnson was not a pacifist, and the world he operated in did not permit pacifism. He was arrested numerous times throughout his career. He served significant prison time, including a devastating stretch in Alcatraz beginning in 1953, convicted on federal narcotics charges that he and his supporters maintained were fabricated or exaggerated. The narcotics charge was, for Johnson, a particular injustice. Multiple accounts indicate that Johnson was, in fact, opposed to the heroin trade that was beginning to take hold in Harlem in the late 1940s and early 1950s. He understood that with the clarity of a man who lived among the people affected, that heroin would destroy the community he had spent his life building. The drug turned productive people into desperate ones. It turned families into ruins. It turned neighborhoods into wastelands. Whether Johnson was entirely innocent of the charges against him remains a matter of historical debate, but what is not debated is that he saw the narcotics trade as a threat to everything he valued, and that his conviction removed from Harlem the one figure with the authority and the will to resist it. Alcatraz was designed to break men. It was a prison for prisoners whom other prisons could not contain, a rock in the middle of San Francisco Bay, where the federal government sent the people it most wanted to forget. Johnson spent nearly a decade there, from 1953 to the early 1960s. The conditions were harsh. The isolation from Harlem, from his family, from his network, and from the streets he had walked since boyhood, was a kind of exile that prison alone does not convey. Alcatraz was not simply incarceration. It was erasure, an attempt to remove Johnson so completely from the world he had built that by the time he returned, there would be nothing left to return to. The attempt failed, and its failure was perhaps the strongest evidence of the kind of power Johnson had built. His network did not collapse in his absence. His allies continued to operate. His influence persisted, transmitted through the relationships and loyalties he had cultivated over decades. Messages passed in and out of the prison through channels that the federal authorities either could not detect or chose not to disrupt. Johnson's associates in Harlem maintained the structures he had built, and not because he was paying them. His finances were severely constrained during his imprisonment, but because the bonds he had forged were genuine and the loyalty he had earned was not contingent on his physical presence. When he returned to Harlem in the early 1960s, the neighborhood received him not as a returning convict, but as a returning leader. The reception was not a celebration in the conventional sense. There was no parade, no public ceremony. But the word moved through Harlem with the speed of something that needed no amplification. Bumpy was home. The Harlem he returned to was changing. The civil rights movement was in full force. Malcolm X was preaching from the podium of the Nation of Islam's mosque on 116th Street. The language of black empowerment, black self-determination, and black resistance to white supremacy was everywhere. And Bumpy Johnson, who had been fighting a version of that same fight on different terrain for 30 years, found himself in a position of unique relevance. He was a bridge between the old Harlem and the new, between the street-level reality of black life and the political aspirations of a community that was beginning to demand, loudly and collectively, the rights and dignity it had been denied. Johnson's relationship with Malcolm X is a matter of historical record, although the exact nature and depth of that relationship is debated among historians. What is not debated is that the two men knew each other, that they operated in overlapping circles, and that they shared a fundamental commitment to the idea that black communities should control their own economic and political destinies. Johnson's approach was different from Malcolm X's, less public, less ideological, more rooted in the practical realities of power as it was actually exercised on the streets of Harlem, but the underlying vision was aligned. In the years following his return from prison, Johnson intensified his efforts to build black economic independence in Harlem. He was involved in efforts to bring legitimate business opportunities to the neighborhood. He supported black entrepreneurs. He used his influence and his reputation to create spaces of safety and autonomy within a community that was under pressure from every direction, from the police, from the Italian families, from the emerging drug trade that was beginning to devastate black neighborhoods across America, and from the broader forces of urban decline and institutional neglect. And it was during this period that the full significance of his earlier decision, the decision not to harm his friend's son, became most visible. Johnson's power, by the early to mid-1960s, was qualitatively different from what it had been in the 1930s or 1940s. It was no longer primarily the power of a man who could order violence. It was the power of a man who had, through decades of patient investment, become indispensable to the functioning of an entire community. Shopkeepers trusted him. Ministers respected him. Political figures sought his counsel. Young men who might otherwise have followed the path of the friend's son, the path of betrayal, of short-term alliance with outside interests, looked at Johnson and saw a different model of manhood, one in which loyalty and principle were not weaknesses, but the very sources of strength. The opposing powers, whether the Italian families, the corrupt police officials, or the political figures who had long treated Harlem as a colony to be exploited, found that their usual tools of control were increasingly ineffective. Threats failed because Johnson's network was too broad and too deep to be disrupted by threatening any single node within it. Bribery failed because the loyalty Johnson had earned was not transactional. It was personal, and personal loyalty could not be purchased by a higher bidder. Legal pressure failed because Johnson had cultivated relationships with lawyers and political allies who could fight back through the courts and through the political process. The opposing powers were not defeated in the way that opposing powers are defeated in movies. There was no dramatic scene, no final battle, no moment of surrender. Instead, They simply found, over time, that the cost of maintaining their dominance over Harlem exceeded the benefits, and they began, gradually, and to negotiate rather than dictate. The visible, verifiable changes that resulted from Johnson's long campaign of strategic power building were real, even if they were not always dramatic. Black operators in Harlem's economic landscape, both legal and illegal, operated with greater autonomy than they had at any point since Dutch Schultz's invasion in the early 1930s. Black-owned businesses in the neighborhood were more numerous and more stable. The community's internal economy was stronger. And the people of Harlem, ordinary people, working people, families, had, in Johnson, a figure who represented the possibility that power could be held by someone who looked like them, who lived among them, and who answered to them in a way that no distant political figure or outside authority ever had. Johnson's health declined in the later 1960s. He had heart problems, a condition exacerbated by decades of stress, imprisonment, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from spending an entire life in a state of heightened vigilance. The toll was visible to those who knew him, the slightly slower step, the occasional pause in conversation, the careful way he lowered himself into a chair. But his mind remained sharp, and his presence in Harlem continued to carry the weight it always had. He was still consulted on matters of community importance. He still walked the streets of the neighborhood he considered his own. He still dressed impeccably, his appearance a final, quiet insistence on the dignity he had spent his life defending. On July 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson collapsed and died of a heart attack at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue in Harlem. He was 62 years old. He died in Harlem, among Harlem people in a Harlem establishment. There was a symmetry in this that was not lost on those who knew his story. A man who had dedicated his life to this place, dying within it, surrounded by it, as though the neighborhood itself were the only fitting witness to his end. The funeral that followed was, by all accounts, one of the largest Harlem had ever seen. Thousands came. Not just figures from the underworld, though they were there in force, dressed in dark suits and standing with the rigid composure of men who understood that they were burying something that could not easily be replaced. Ministers came, men who had stood behind pulpits and prayed for a community that Johnson had, in his own way, also served. Business owners came, people whose shops and restaurants had survived because Johnson's presence had created a zone of stability around them. Lawyers and political figures came, people who had worked alongside Johnson in the complex borderlands where street power and political power overlapped. Teachers came. Mothers who had received envelopes of cash when they could not pay their rent came, and they wept openly, without embarrassment, because the man they were mourning had seen them in their worst moments and had helped them without asking for anything in return except the one thing he valued above all else: loyalty. Children who had received school supplies from a man they knew only as a neighborhood elder came, some of them too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to sense that the grief around them was of a quality they had never encountered before. The procession moved through streets that Johnson had walked for almost 50 years, and the people who lined those streets were not mourning a gangster. And they were mourning the loss of something far more complex and far more valuable. A man who had, within the brutal constraints of his time and place, built a form of power that was rooted in loyalty sustained by intelligence, and directed toward the protection and empowerment of his community. The decision not to harm his friend's son, a decision that in the immediate moment must have felt like an impossible act of restraint, proved to be one of the foundational acts of Johnson's legacy. And it became a story told and retold in Harlem, not because it was dramatic, but because it was instructive. It taught that there was a form of strength that existed beyond violence, a form of power that was built not by destroying enemies, but by honoring bonds. The men who heard that story and were moved by it, the hard men, the men who lived by the code of the street and understood better than anyone the cost of unanswered betrayal, were moved precisely because they understood what Johnson had sacrificed in making that choice. He had sacrificed the easiest and most immediate form of justice. He had sacrificed the satisfaction of righteous anger. He had sacrificed, in the eyes of some, the appearance of invulnerability. And, in return, he had gained something that could not be taken away by any ambush, any arrest, or any act of force. He had gained the permanent, unshakable loyalty of every man who heard that story and understood what it meant. The legacy Bumpy Johnson left behind extended far beyond the details of his own life. He became, in the decades after his death, a symbol of a particular idea about black power in America. The idea that power could be built from within a community, through relationships and loyalty and patient strategic investment, even under conditions of extreme oppression and systematic exclusion. This idea was not unique to Johnson, of course. It was the idea that animated the civil rights movement, the black business movement, and countless community organizations across the country. But Johnson embodied it in a way that was particularly vivid and particularly resonant for the people of Harlem, because he had lived it not in the relatively safe spaces of political rhetoric or academic theory, but on the streets. Yeah, where the consequences of failure were immediate and often fatal. His life has been fictionalized many times, in films, television series, and novels that have sometimes obscured the real man behind layers of dramatic invention. The 2019 television series Godfather of Harlem, starring Forrest Whitaker, brought renewed attention to Johnson's story, though like all dramatizations, it took liberties with the historical record. The real Bumpy Johnson was, in many ways, more interesting and more instructive than any fictional version could be, because the real Bumpy Johnson was a man who understood something that most people, criminal or legitimate, black or white, powerful or powerless, never fully grasp. He understood that the strongest form of power is the form that does not need to be displayed. He understood that the most effective form of strategy is the form that operates so slowly and so quietly that the opposing power does not recognize it until the ground has already shifted beneath their feet. And he understood, most importantly, that in a world designed to isolate, degrade, and exploit black people, the most revolutionary act was not destruction, but construction, the patient, deliberate building of bonds of trust and loyalty strong enough to sustain a community against everything that was arrayed against it. The barber shop on West 135th Street is long gone. The Harlem of Bumpy Johnson's era has been transformed by decades of change, gentrification, demographic shifts, the rise and fall of the crack epidemic, the ongoing struggle for economic justice. But the story of the man who sat alone at that table, who received news of a betrayal that would have justified any violence, and who chose instead to honor a bond that was older and deeper than anger. That story remains. It remains not as legend, though it has become that, but as evidence. Evidence that power, real power, the kind that outlasts any individual and reshapes the world even after the individual is gone, does not come from the ability to destroy. It comes from the willingness to build. And it comes, sometimes, from the hardest thing of all, the willingness to show mercy when every rule of the world you live in says you should not. Bumpy Johnson chose mercy, and that choice made him more powerful than any act of violence ever could.